start by putting myself into a bit of context. So, before I open this, I was thinking at the beginning of this session that I was going to stand out as being very different from everyone else. I'm a conservation biologist. I don't directly work on anything to do with climate or adaptation, well, climate change and adaptation, although I do study how variation in climate affects endangered ecosystems. And so that's the hat I'm wearing today, but it turns out that my thinking that I was going to be very different is not true. I don't want to say anything. I'll just have to do that, right? Yeah, cool. I want to start with this idea, this first question about concern and or hope. And I guess I'm left mostly with some concern. And the main one is how we can translate the things that we're talking about today into policy. So as inspirational as the story we were told at lunch is, I would like to know, I mean, all of that had to do with policy changes. So how do we do that? And I'll tell you why I say that as my first comment. It's because as an educator, I have been talking to undergraduates for the 10 years I've been at SFU, and that's what they want to know. When I started 10 years ago, I was having to convince them that climate change was real and had an anthropogenic cause. That's not the case now. Now I have to work with their hopelessness, and I don't know what to tell them about what they should be doing. So that's my opening comment. And now, the invitation to be here came when I was actually in Kyoto at a symposium on plant-insect interactions under climate change. And so it was very interesting to get the invitation while I was in Kyoto, of all cities. And I chose to show this montage of images to get people thinking about insects because I assumed we'd all be talking about polar bears, but I was wrong because insects are the focus of what we here in BC are talking about with the pine beetle. About 40% of our species worldwide are insects, and they're really important pests, not just of our forests, but of our crops. They're also really important for ecological life support. So insects that eat the pests that are eating our forests and our crops, and insects that are important in decomposition, and insects like the ones I study on this slide, the pollinators. We're just beginning to understand the impact of climate change on interactions between plants and insects. And it's turning out that it's more complicated than we imagined, both because there are direct effects of temperature and indirect, and also direct effects of carbon, and they're not working in the same direction. These images capture two issues that I wanted to briefly talk about regarding my point of view and my constituency's point of view about climate change. One is the maps show the ecosystem in which I work. It's the Garry Oak ecosystem. It's the third most endangered ecosystem here in Canada. And the inset map shows the Saanich Peninsula. The green areas are where we used to have Garry Oak ecosystem, and the red are where it remains. It's less than 5% is left. We talk about how we expect ecosystems to shift northward with climate change. That's not an unreasonable assumption. We know that even in the Georgia Basin, even here, temperatures have risen in the past 50 years by about 1.5 degrees C. But when you have the reality of fragmented ecosystems like we have because of us, because we build on ecosystems, these ecosystems can't shift northward, not without our intervention. And that's something that we all need to be cognizant of. There's actually a government scientist who says that the Garry Oak ecosystem is going to move all the way up to Haida Gwaii, and I don't think so. It's not going to be able to get there with the pace of change that we're talking about. And I'm reminded, actually, I think it was just last year that one of our First Nations groups was physically lifting salmon out of the water and carrying them upstream because it was so dry that there wasn't enough water for them to swim in. We may have to do that kind of mitigation in the future. The other thing I wanted to point out, that's a canola field. It's near one of the places I work, not in BC, but crops, of course, rely on pollinators, and there's other things that we don't tend to think about when we focus on the sexy, charismatic vertebrates that are usually the focus of conservation. Work done at SFU by graduate student Laura Morandin and Mark Winston, who's currently associated here with the Center for Dialogue, showed that if you leave some wild land near your canola fields, and that is, you don't cultivate all your property as a farmer, you'll actually make more money. And the reason you'll make more money is because those wild places support things like those wild bees that are doing the pollination of your crop. We need to all recognize that conservation and the environment and biodiversity, as was said earlier today, are not in conflict with economic growth. That's the constituency that I'm representing today. As far as my opinion about strengths and weaknesses for meeting the challenges of adaptation, in Canada we have a great group of scientists that can contribute to this dialogue. In BC, as we heard earlier, we've initiated the idea of the carbon footprint, of fishing down the food chain, of all sorts of things. And that's great. And I'm part of a group that is trying to actually work better to link academic science with policy. And we need to do that better, and I think that's our weakness. Scientists tend to be ivory tower pointy heads. I know Candy might agree with me on that one. And I think I want to speak to all that people that self-identified as academics and stood up and first thing this morning and encourage you to do one thing. We tend to think as scientists that our number one goal is to be objective. And of course, when we're looking at our data, we do need to do that. But we can't take objectivity too far. We have to recognize that our data tells us something, and we have to make the effort to speak to the public, to policymakers, about what those data mean. We have to do a better job of communicating and being part of dialogue so that the things that we know from a scientific view are accessible to regular, everyday people in those northern communities everywhere in BC and Canada, so that we all can do what we need to do to adapt to climate change.